By the title, you might think this story is about an old, spooky, abandoned cabin, but that's not the case. The cabin in this story is actually quite modern, and my friend Alexis still lives there with his family to this day. The cabin is in a very beautiful part of Montana, right next to a river. Alexis has been living in this cabin for about 10 years. When I first met him, I thought his house was pretty cool. I mean, living in a large, stylish cabin all year round, surrounded by nothing but a river and woods. What's not to like? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. My first and only personal experience with strange happenings at his house occurred about 2 months after meeting Alexis. He hadn't mentioned that his house was haunted. I think he didn't want to scare me or was in denial. But after this, he told me about his experiences in the house. My experience took place in his theater room, which was very creepy if the projector and screen weren't on. We were playing on his PlayStation when suddenly the console turned off. The lights were dimmed, so the room wasn't in complete darkness. The lighting was enough to make out everything in the room, but not clearly. Alexis looked at me, and I saw all the color drain from his face. He even told me that we needed to leave the room. I did as he said, and he was right behind me. We slowly left the theater room. Once outside, I asked him what had happened. That's when he told me that after the console turned off, he saw the silhouette of a man standing right behind me. After this, he told me about other things that had been happening in his house, things that had been going on for all these years. I won't tell you all of them, but most were much scarier than what had just happened to us. Alexis said that every night around 5 a.m., the door to his bedroom would open and slam shut several times for about 5 minutes. He also heard his voice screaming from deep in the woods. When he went outside, it was his own voice. I remember once, while we were on a Skype call, there was someone laughing in the background. It sounded like a child, although Alexis doesn't have a younger brother. He doesn't know exactly why his house is haunted. And because they live in front of a river, sometimes boats stop at their back. When they first moved in, a nice family stopped while they were rafting. While Alexis and his family were outside, they said they were happy that someone had finally moved into the house. Alexis's mom was confused because there was an old couple living there before Alexis's family moved in. But they told her they just assumed the place was always empty because the house was always completely dark inside. No lights were ever on and all the windows were always closed. Alexis had gotten used to all the paranormal activity in the house, but one question remained with me. What had happened there to make it so terrifying? I grew up in the rural heart of central Indiana, in small towns centered around agriculture and related jobs. These quintessential towns were filled with people who knew each other, where baseball, especially the local Little League travel teams, was the major event in the area when the Colts weren't losing, which they did quite poorly back then. There were barbecues, picnics, and parades, and the town felt like something straight out of a movie. That scene is something I hold very dear in my memories, despite a dark event that still haunts me. One day I was attending my older brother's baseball game in a nearby town. When I wasn't physically playing, I generally could only stand to watch a few innings from the rough pine bleachers before I got restless. About 100 meters towards the edge of the forest, there was a playground filled with children of all ages, some of whom I knew from the local teams. They were my age. After running around and exploring the playground, which I had never visited before, and playing a few rounds of tag with some of the other kids, a couple of boys my age and I were approached by an older boy, probably in his late teens from what I recall. He started talking to us, telling us some eerie stories about the town and the surrounding area. I remember he seemed very charming and entertaining in the way he told the stories. He had a relatively captive audience for a while, but for various reasons, the other kids I was with either lost interest and left, or needed to return to their families at the baseball field. So there I was, just me and the older boy. He talked about a cabin he liked to explore that was just inside the edge of the forest. He said 2 brothers had fought there years ago, throwing axes and shovels at each other, and apparently, they both died from the injuries they inflicted on each other. He said I was probably too scared to go see it with him, especially because I was so young. But being a kid always trying to prove I was tougher and more mature than my peers, I insisted that his little story didn't scare me, and that I'd actually love to see the house and explore it for a minute. Now I know what you're thinking. I was foolish to play along and be alone with any kind of stranger. But keep in mind, I was a child. I grew up in a place where really nothing bad ever happened, and naively I always assumed everyone was as nice as the last person and always gave them the benefit of the doubt. So we entered the woods and immediately started climbing a steep hill. When we reached the top, we could see the baseball field down below through the trees. Then we turned sharply towards our bikes about 90 degrees and rode across the top of the hill, which turned out to be more of a ridge. Then we entered a clearing that was actually accessible by vehicle from the baseball field. We crossed and entered another edge of the forest. As we climbed this hill, I finally asked if the cabin was much further because I assumed it was very close. He assured me it was just over the hill and we continued on. Later, I found out that at this moment my father, who had been watching the baseball game, finally noticed he couldn't see me. He looked on in panic, and another parent, a grizzled veteran and family friend, told him they had to get into his truck and look for me immediately. The last place the other kids had seen me was the forest directly behind the playground, not the woods we had turned into. My father and the veteran tore across the field in the truck, ignoring the baseball game. The veteran, understanding how to track people in the woods, correctly assumed I had been led in a misleading direction.